Hi, I'm Carys, and you are listening to Over the Top, Under the Radar, a weekly look at the stories in the news agenda that are going over the top and the ones flying completely under the radar and not being talked about enough. I'm here today with Adam Green from the Progressive Change Campaign Committee, which is a political action committee in the United States, and we're going to talk about American politics. I'm here with the brilliant Adam Green, whose voice might be familiar to regular listeners. How are you doing, Adam?
Doing well. Great to be back.
Great to have you back. I mean, not much has happened in the few months since you were last on the show. So, Adam, you're based not just in America, but in Washington, D.C. That's right.
I am in Washington, D.C., although we met at the Glastonbury Festival in the
We
UK
did. We
the
met in
first
the
time.
UK in a field
Yeah.
and danced to, who did we dance to? En Vogue?
That sounds right.
Yeah. Danced to En Vogue, both incredibly sober and with it. Yeah, it's been a minute and a lot's been happening. If you could use one word to describe the last few months in US politics, what would you say?
Chaotic. Things are definitely chaotic, but there's a big difference between this February and March chaotic versus last February and March. Last February and March, it felt like Trump was on a roll. Elon Musk was in the White House. They were taking a wrecking ball to the entire government, and very few people had a great theory on fighting back. Right now, Trump's popularity is at a record low. It seems like the default is that they will lose miserably in the election, assuming that they don't interfere with the election. And while it is chaotic, at least we have a Democratic Party that is in the ring, not always fighting most effectively, but we have a grassroots that's engaged, a Democratic Party that's at least engaged, and it feels better than it did a year ago.
Okay, that's good. That's optimistic. Yeah, I feel like we need a bit of optimism at the moment. Well, we're gonna jump into it. Adam and I are gonna talk through parts of the US news agenda that have gone over the top or flown under the radar. And I'm gonna kick us off. I want to talk to you about Epstein. Adam, I think you're the first person that explained to me the extent of the Trump paranoia around Epstein. And so, like, well over a year ago, I think you were like, well, Congress has gone into recess a little soon, and that might be because of a certain man called Jeffrey Epstein. And like in the months that followed, I feel like we've all heard a lot about Epstein and the Epstein files and his association with Trump and various other people. But I guess it feels over the top to me because it feels like there's so many hearings, there's so many files, there's so much media coverage. But like looking at it from the UK, it just seems like not much has actually changed in the US. Like no one's gone on trial, no victims have been paid any damages, like no one is in prison other than Ghislaine Maxwell, who, dutifully pled the Fifth Amendment when she was called before Congress. Am I right? Like, is Epstein sort of massively overblown, or do you think things are shifting as a result of the Epstein files?
Things are definitely shifting. There's a cleavage within the Republican Party with some parts of the base feeling inclined to pressure Trump and Pam Bondi, our Attorney General, and others to do more in terms of releasing and having accountability. So that's helpful. The thing that I think is actually underexplored in this country is everything beyond the absolutely morally reprehensible, sex trafficking part of it, including the billionaire oligarchs, many of whom are on stage and in the White House with Trump, who are part of this, very real international cabal of wealthy people who think that the rules don't apply to them, whether it's sex trafficking rules or respect for workers or anything having to do with international norms. Like they think they operate in their own little world. And that hasn't really been explored as much in this country. There's a foreign influence part of this, which has gotten almost zero coverage in this country. But it seems pretty clear to
Do you
me
want
that
do
this
you
is
want to
not
say more
just,
about that?
yeah, I mean, there's not, this isn't just a guy with a sex ring. This is a guy who is funded by someone, likely trying to have, blackmail potential over a lot of powerful people. And I don't think it's overly conspiratorial to say that. It just seems like it's staring us right in the face. A lot of things in the emails themselves allude to that, but the American media has barely pulled that string. They're just talking about, oh, this person's named in the file. Here's some salacious things that happened. And even with the salacious things that have happened, there's been no arrests. So it's kind of underwhelming. If anything, I think we need more coverage of the real accountability needed in this moment, not just coverage of the smoke coming from the fire.
And why do you think, like, because when we first spoke about this, a long time ago, you alluded to the fact that lots of Democrats would be implicated alongside Republicans. Why do you think we're not getting that extra layer of digging, or why? I mean, let's not pretend it's necessarily going to lead to arrest. But in the UK, at least, there was real fallout for the artist formerly known as Prince Andrew and he's still Lord Mandelson, Labour politician, who both, I mean, just because of the extent and the depth of their relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, but also both allegedly, based on the recent files dump, were forwarding on state secrets, investment tips, like insider information to Jeffrey Epstein, just sort of casually from their Blackberries or whatever phone they had then. I mean, has that? Surely there are Americans who did that, or it's just not getting picked up. Like,
I mean, one thing I will definitely give the UK credit for is despite the blaring headlines from your tabloids, there is still the ability to be shocked as a nation. And things like this will actually kind of register on the Richter scale. In this
mm,
country, I just think that it's kind of being folded into the mix. And by the mix, I mean, there are billionaires who are buying all the media companies. There are billionaires who have bought access to the White House. There are billionaires who are writing AI policy. They control everything. And not a lot of people are thinking proactively about challenging those powerful interests. And if we had someone in the White House who was kind of setting the tone of there will be accountability, then it would kind of become part of the culture, and maybe there'd be a feeding frenzy among the media to hold billionaires, including the billionaires who own the media, accountable. But there's no culture right now of accountability in this country, whether it's on Epstein matters or anything else going on. Including Trump launching Trump coin and making $3 billion. And theoretically, there should be regulators who crack down on that, but
no,
there's not.
okay, that one passed me by. You're going to have that flew under my radar. What
Oh,
has
wow,
literally launched his
interesting.
own cryptocurrency.
Oh yeah, oh please. This is early last year. Yeah. He launched his own Chris. So it's basically become this like legalized bribery where anybody who wants influence with Trump can just make known that they just bought billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Trump coin. Then the valuation goes up and his holdings go up. And now he's billions of dollars richer. This has actually happened in the last, I think 3/4 of a year. So again, the rules are gone, and that's why the midterms will matter. If we have a Democratic House and or Senate, at least Democrats will have some subpoena power, the ability to drive an agenda, and even impeach officials, and that's a starting point.
Because right now, just for people who, don't recall, Trump obviously has the White House and the Republicans hold both the Senate and the House of Representatives. So it's pretty much they have carte blanche, like they can do whatever they want because they have majorities. There's not in a bit. Is that fair?
That is right. I mean, the Constitution says we have checks and balances. What we've had is real fealty, real sycophantic behavior from Republicans who don't want to cross Trump at all. And a practical ramification of that is there's something called the Oversight Committee, the Government Oversight Committee, and the U.S. House of Representatives.
Mm.
Theoretically, they should be hauling people in, saying, "Why is this being allowed? Why aren't you doing stuff on this?" But Republican chairs have very little interest. It actually was kind of a showstopper and a surprise that the Epstein files were subpoenaed by a Republican committee. And what actually happened there was some very crafty Democrats, led by a guy named Robert Garcia, a California congressman, waited until a sufficient amount of Republicans had left the room. And they knew that some of the remaining Republicans who were in the room were some of the few outliers who were willing to subpoena the Epstein files. And then they called the vote and they won. And it was like, oh my, if more people had been in the room, we would have lost. But that is what actually set off the chain of events, which then
Wow.
led to Trump having to eventually turn them over and got us where we are today, including Lord Mendelson and others.
I'm interested in this idea of like Americans almost being unshockable now. Like, I guess there is a degree to which we're all a little numb because of the sheer amount of chaos that comes out of the White House. Is there really nothing that's cut through on Epstein? Nothing that's like shocked? Nothing that's like held people's attention?
Well, again, the Epstein files themselves coming out have broken through. And it was kind of the perfect storm where Trump had actually been calling for them to be released as a candidate
Yeah.
and kind of created this monster that he then couldn't control. I don't know how he ever thought he can get away with that. I mean, I've been on Fox News before. Being on Fox News, owned by Rupert Murdoch, is like being in a different universe. Like there are just fake facts coming at you where it's like, whoa, how are you even thinking that's plausible? But if you watch it for a while, you realize like it's just a completely different diet. I will flip through
Mm,
CNN and some of the other outlets here, and they'll all be relatively, degrees away from each other within the same ballpark. And then you turn on Fox, and if it's anything critical of Trump, you just don't hear it. But they couldn't escape their own viewers after Trump had revved up that engine for a year or years, and then so that actually broke through. Again, I don't think it's being interpreted as maximalist as it could. It's being interpreted as a sex scandal, um, you know, but not really,
Not like a political or an economic scandal.
yeah, political economic, or even with the sex scandal, there's not really the call for accountability. Like, you know, yeah. So that's where we are.
But that's I feel like that's, is it and well, maybe it's not enough on Epstein because 'cause we're not going deep enough on Epstein, but, like, and I am interested, you're right, that the sort of state-sponsored or, like, who had an interest in Epstein compromat is very underexplored, even in the UK, everywhere, I'd say.
Yeah. There's one thing I would just a little glimmer of hope. So there was a guy named Larry Summers. He was basically our version of the chancellor of the exchequer in this country.
Yes, Larry,
Under
big name.
Yes, big name, big Wall Street tool. If there's a opportunity to chime in against progressives and for corporate interests, he will be there. He was on the board of OpenAI, which is literally rewriting the code of society, the rules of society. He was named many times in the Epstein files, and within days of that being exposed, he was forced off the board of OpenAI. He used to be president of Harvard University. He isn't anymore, but he was a professor there. That has been shut down as well. So there's a bit of accountability. However, Howard Lutnick is the current Secretary of the Treasury, our version of the Chancellor of the Exchequer under Trump. He's also all over the Epstein files. So I predict that in coming months, there will be a growing call in this country for him to step down or be impeached. And there are little baby steps towards accountability. And what's significant about that is he's not just a cabinet member of Trump; he is the liaison to corporate America. So that would be an important merger of the Epstein files and corporate accountability to some extent, but there's a lot more that should be happening.
And is he the one who sort of publicly proclaimed that he had, like, severed ties with Epstein, and then the files came out and it was like, "No, you didn't. You went to the island with your whole family."
And then you have Elon Musk, who also was in the Epstein files, requesting access to his parties, but for some reason he's playing the role of release more files as if he's got clean hands.
Well, also, when him and Trump had their little falling out, he did this kind of mic drop thing where he was like, "Well, Donald Trump's in the Epstein files." And it's like, "Bro, you're in the Epstein files. You're in the Epstein files with, like, getting sort of, like, rejected by Epstein." There's literally that weird email exchange where he's like, "Hey, any parties?" And, like, Jeffrey Epstein emails his EA and is like, "Deal with this." And it's just like, "Oh, Elon, there aren't any parties. Sorry, we'll get in touch if there are." So it's like, not only are you in the files, you're, like, begging to come to parties that, like, most people seem to be able to get into. So yeah, I don't know. Has that had any? Is he just like withdrawn from political life now, so that doesn't have any consequences? Like,
He's still a threat. I mean, he is on track to potentially become the first trillionaire in history. One of his companies, Starlink, which controls a lot of the data around the world, is about to IPO and go public, which will put a bunch more money in his pocket. So I kind of feel like with so many people, he is taking some time to resuscitate himself, his image, and then probably will come back at some point. So we should not keep our eyes off of him.
you're listening to this show ad free thanks to our Patreon community. If you enjoy the podcast, please consider supporting us on Patreon today. Right now, a few hundred people make a small donation every month, and that means a few thousand people can listen to this show. Patreon supporters cover our production costs, and they help to make the podcast fully sustainable. We need about 80 more supporters. If you've been thinking about signing up, please do it today. When you join us on Patreon, you get a bonus episode every week, you get a behind-the-scenes newsletter every week, you get the chance to submit questions to our guests in advance, and access to the over-under WhatsApp community so you can keep the conversation going between shows. Packages start from as little as £3 a month. Go to patreon.com/over-the-top under the radar. Another over the top I wanted to discuss with you, and again, I'm curious if you think it is we get a lot of coverage here about ICE, and the frankly terrifying, like, sort of paramilitary vibes, immigration removal force that now has been deployed in lots of I would say, entirely left leaning, like Democrat leaning areas, obviously Minnesota and Minneapolis, like most notably. And there was like a big flurry of press coverage last week when Kristi Noem was fired. But I guess wonder like, to what extent do you think there's any substantive change? Like, is this a bit over the top of like lots of criticism of ICE, lots of like, this is terrible, but like, has actual policy changed?
Well, so first, I would say the political culture has changed in this country. In the first Trump administration, those who were seen as wanting to hold Trump accountable were seen as fringe or left wing within the Democratic Party. Right now, we have a very united Democratic Party saying this is unacceptable. This is fascism. This is thuggery in the streets. This is not immigration enforcement. This is Trump's personal army, stormtroopers invading our cities. And it might not be world news at this point, but technically, our Department of Homeland Security is currently shut down and has been for approaching a month now. Some bare essentials by law continue to get funded, but a significant number of government workers who work for Homeland Security are not going to work because Democrats have drawn a line in the sand in the Senate and stayed unified so far. What usually happens in these situations is Republicans give some little tepid something, and then half the Democrats cave. And but right now, it actually is pretty strong testament to how much of an abuse of power this is. That people across the political spectrum within the Democratic Party are staying unified, and that gives me hope. There was actually an election in my home state of New Jersey, not to be confused with Old Jersey, in your neck of the woods, where there's just a special election a few weeks ago where a big, in this country, we have big outside dark money trying to flood elections, which we can talk about more in a second. But they were attempting to take down a former congressman who was making a comeback, who they didn't like on their issue. It was actually APAC running ads pretty much. They have like a Netanyahu agenda, but they don't ever advertise on the things that they care about. They advertise on what they think is popular with local voters. And what they advertised was, oh, this former congressman back when he was in Congress voted to increase funding for ICE. I found that as a really interesting testament to how important an election this will be in the midterms this year. Because if even the bad guys accept that ICE is radioactive among voters and are airing TV ads
Mm.
as disingenuous attacks on people to hide their true agenda,
So
that
wait, so APAC, an APAC funded ad ran an attack ad saying like, this guy loves ice.
yeah, pretty much.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, do I think that guy loves ICE? No, I'm sure he'd be lockstep with most other Democrats right now. But I'm sure it's true that at some point he voted for a very large agenda that happened to, you know, inch up ICE's funding. But again, it was just fascinating to me. I think that was a harbinger of what is to come, which is this is not a fringe issue. This is not a wing of the Democratic Party issue. This is something that will be politically toxic for Republicans and Trump in this year's midterms, and a good sign for the world if we think about restoring some norms when it comes to not abusing power and trampling people on the streets.
Yeah, I mean, from a UK perspective, Reform UK, which, Nigel Farage is a very good pal of Donald Trump, have already sort of unveiled a like ICE-like proposal. And I guess, yeah, the big hope is that ICE will become so toxic and like any sort of mass immigration removals will be so associated with Trump that hopefully they won't be politically feasible. This is the hope, Adam. I don't know if it's a realistic hope.
Yeah. I mean, if I had to project some hopes on other countries, one thing we really got wrong in this country in pretending this moment could never happen again, like a second Trump presidency, is we didn't really empower state and local officials to fight back in a meaningful way as masked people invaded their cities, arrested US citizens, arrested people who were doing nothing wrong, arrested people at their job site, and used violence in the course of everything. Part of what Democrats are insisting on now to reopen that part of the government is they can't wear face masks. They must wear body cameras, right? There can't be dispute about what happened, right? People get whisked off to jail and their family has no idea where they are. We actually have a different system of justice in this country for those taken in under immigration auspices as opposed to normal criminal law. I don't know if that's true in other countries, but it's a huge gap in the system here where people just be carted off for months and nobody knows. They have no access to a lawyer, no day in court. It's horrible. So protections have to happen now while the good or okay guys are in power to say like, oh, what can the mayor of London do to protect their people, right? That has to be ironed out now. And I would hope that the impact of ICE is not for people to only scorn America or scorn Trump, but to really kind of put in some protections for if that ever happens in other countries.
You've hinted at it, so maybe we should get on to what I think is your under the radar, which is the US midterms. So tell us about that, because I think certainly over here, we don't hear it. We don't really hear much about the midterms. We know that we're happening. A lot of the current, I mean, I don't know how to describe what's happening in Iran that right now, but like a lot of there is sort of hints of like maybe this won't be good for the midterms because the oil price is through the roof and you've started a war that could have no end. Because Iran are willing to dig in. Like from your perspective, like what are we not paying attention to about the midterms? Like what should we know about the midterms?
Well, we started to talk about the stakes, and the stakes are if Democrats take the House and or the Senate, both of which are possible this election cycle, they will have the ability to have way more accountability for Trump, subpoena power, impeachment power, investigation power, and the power to just drive the national agenda by scheduling votes on the right things. Even the Epstein files, I guess, as we talked about on this podcast months ago, simply didn't come up for a vote because Republicans were in charge. So that's the first piece. So then the question is like, okay, feasibility and what's the dynamic like? And Donald Trump has a record low popularity. If the election were held today, Republicans would be swept out of Congress. And there's a very real opportunity to take back the US Senate, which was not seen as on limits just a couple months ago. But things are that bad for Republicans right now. I know you have your by elections every several months. We've been having special elections when people retire from Congress, when people retire or graduate from state legislatures. And I believe in 10 separate state elections, Republican seats have flipped to Democrats. 0 Democratic seats have flipped to Republican. We've seen congressional elections where Democrats are doing way better than they've ever done before. There was actually just an election that I was on the ground for in Texas a couple weeks ago. For the first time in decades, in a primary where Republicans choose their nominee and Democrats choose their nominee, more Democrats in Texas showed up to vote than Republicans showed up to vote. In past years, even the first Trump midterm, where Democrats came 2 points away from knocking off Ted Cruz, a Republican senator, that happened in an environment where there were way fewer Democrats who showed up to vote in the primary. So what that says to me is if we came 2 points away last time, things are so much better in terms of wind at our back this time. Sadly, they're better politically because things are so bad on the government side. At least the public is paying attention. And that is what really matters. Our organization, the Progressive Change Campaign Committee, has a core theory of the case for the year, which is use the 2026 elections to prove the concept that bold, inspiring, economic populist crusaders for working people against billionaire and corporate power can win in swing elections. So that as we approach the presidential election and the presidential primary starting in 2027, Democratic voters who sometimes are scared and don't want to accidentally mess up by voting for someone that they're inspired by, and they know that inspiring, bold economic populists just won swing areas, and therefore they can, there'll be a market for that kind of candidate running for president.
To put it crudely, that's like more Mamdani like candidates, right? Who are kind of economically left wing. They're standing up to rich people. They're calling for wealth taxes. They're talking about affordability. Like, so are there lots of Mamdani like candidates ready for November midterms?
Yeah. So as someone who does a lot of jousting with the more corporate side of our party on social media or wherever, the talking point that they would use with Mamdani is, oh well, of course he can win in blue New York, but you can't put someone like that up in a swing state, and that is part of the genesis of, or at least a supporting detail for why we have this theory of the case for the year. The good news is yes. So when I was in Texas, we were supporting someone named James Tallarico, who I don't know, he's a viral sensation here. I don't know how across the pond that goes. But he's someone
I
who,
don't think most listeners probably won't have heard of him. So definitely explain who he is.
okay, well, first I'll spell it Tallarico, James Tallarico. James Tallarico started having a reputation for being able to quote the Bible, and he goes to seminary school.
I think I've seen some of his social media videos where he's quoting the Bible.
Yeah. But we actually interviewed him. And one thing I was really impressed by, there was a cogency to his worldview. No matter what question we asked him on whatever issue, he would bring it down to everyday people challenging billionaire power, corporate power, and systemic change we need in order to do that. And when he was asked on the campaign trail at a town hall meeting, fortunately covered by media and captured on video, someone asked him about this Republican trope of welfare queens, right? People who just take from the system and collect paychecks. And he's like, oh, you know who the real welfare queens are? Corporations who don't pay their taxes and who are leaving us with the bill.
Say it louder for people in the back.
Amen. Someone asked him, oh, well, aren't you just declaring class warfare? He's like, billionaires and the rich have been declaring class warfare on us for 50 years. Trickle down economics is theft, and we need to start fighting back. And that's just in his gut, right? So we were
Ooh.
proud to endorse him in the primary and thrilled that he won the primary. So he is now the Democratic nominee for US Senate in Texas. And that would be a political shockwave, earthquake, if we actually won Texas, which is one of the reddest, most Republican areas in the country, where we have not won statewide since 1990, I believe. Um, there's someone else named Graham Platner running in Maine, Platner. And he is also just a viral sensation. He's a military guy who is, fighting billionaires, fighting corporate power, is an amazing storyteller, just tells a story about power, about how power has been taken away from working people and how the forces of society, including the same cabal people who were involved with Epstein, are working hard to consolidate wealth at the top and minimize what trickles down to the bottom, and how we need to send someone in who isn't just a Democrat, but is an outsider willing to shake up a very broken political and economic system. He is crushing the incumbent Democratic governor who's running against him in a primary for US Senate by over 20 points, according to multiple polls. And he is neck and neck with the longtime Republican US Senator who's been there for approaching 30 years now. And I am very hopeful that if those two people win and a third guy named Abdul El Sayed running in Michigan, another swing state, win key Senate races, it will prove the concept. In this country, we don't just need blah, boring, in bed with corporations, Democrats. We need bold economic, shake up the system outsiders in order to win key races, including eventually the presidency.
And so, for people who aren't familiar with your organization, so you're backing and bankrolling those kind of candidates, the economic populists who don't have the corporate donations. So, how does it work when you find a candidate like that who speaks from the gut, talks your language, is talking about economic populism? What's the next step in terms of helping them to try and win?
Yes, so we have hundreds of thousands of people across America who have joined us. Our website is boldprogressives.org. And when we endorse, one thing we do for Americans on our list is ask them to chip in $3, $50, $100, whatever they can afford to candidates. We often facilitate huge Zooms with our members and these candidates so they can get to know each other. Sometimes invite members of the US Senate or US House to join. Sometimes, movie Mark Ruffalo type celebrities join. And then we send our staff on the ground. So myself and two of my teammates were on the ground in Texas. There's some big Illinois primaries. That's where Chicago, the city of Chicago is. We have two of our staffers going there. We've been to Maine. And, one thing we find is that running a campaign is very much like building a small business. A lot of things are happening very quickly, and having an insertion of expertise and competency who can just help get the job done. We also play connector role to whether it's national donors or national groups that can also endorse, or politicians who can endorse, just people that they should know that they hadn't quite thought to reach out to, reporters, whether locally or nationally. We serve as infrastructure for a set of candidates, hopefully achieving economies of scale that then helps lots of people.
Sort of
Basically,
like a kind of fairy godmother, agent, connector. It sounds like you're doing a lot of things, playing lots of roles.
we do our best. We're, you could say fixer, and
Fixer, yeah, maybe like Olivia Pope vibes. I'm a very big fan of Scandal. What is the alternative argument? So, at this point in time, what are Democrats who don't want to talk about? What do they want to talk about? What's the pitch? I'm genuinely asking. I can't understand what the alternative story is.
There's been an interesting transition in the answer to this question over the last few years. If you had asked me this in 2022, I'd say our party was divided a third, a third, a third on, do we talk about economics? Do we talk about abortion? Or do we talk about democracy? What's happened, particularly after Kamala Harris lost in 2024, with with her saying democracy is on the ballot, with Roe versus Wade in this country having fallen, is that I think even the democracy people and the abortion people generally agree that their agendas will be best served if Democrats can figure out a way to appeal more to working people on economic issues. I've been told this, directly by people who previously were in those camps in terms of prioritizing those as number one. issue. So now what we're actually at is a place where we're questioning, how do we talk about economics? And the division in our party is, do you name villains? Do you call out billionaires? Do you imply there is such a thing as bad corporate actors? Or do you have a more generic approach? Growth for all, fighting for everybody. And my general caution is, you cannot fight for everybody. That is impossible, right? When corporate CEOs are attacking workers, when corporate executives are intentionally jacking up prices for people at the grocery store or at the gas pump, the whole idea of fighting is picking a side. What often happens is groups or entities funded by billionaire donors are less likely to advise calling out those billionaire donors, and groups like ours that are generally funded by the grassroots, have more liberty to give better advice. So that's kind of why people like James Tallarico, who's talking about corporate welfare, and people like Graham Platten are talking about the need to shake up a system that's benefiting billionaires, are our kind of people. But there are also plenty of milquetoast Democrats out there.
It's a really similar thing to what's happening in sort of progressive spaces in the UK. And I think that you've really hit the nail on the head on this idea of like, are you willing to name villains? And I think even if you just look at, if you simplified most British political discourse, there's like a party and a poll and a like position that is like, Britain is broken and like it's because of immigrants. And like that, like the clarity of Reform UK's message and like parts of the Conservative Party and the far right, who are, very emboldened and empowered and on the rise over here, they're really, really clear on who the villains are and who the enemies are. It's work-shy people on welfare. It's, I don't know if you guys get this, military age men, which is this phrase that Nigel Farage loves to use. So this idea of like, because they're not refugees, they're military age men, which makes them sound kind of like menacing and violent. He was asked about, his support for the war in Iran, and he obviously, full-throatedly supports Donald Trump, and Keir Starmer should be, making our bases available. But when someone said, well, will you take refugees if there's a refugee crisis, he was like, I'm very nervous about military age men. So yeah, there's this kind of weird, but also very deliberate and very successful, immigrants are the problem. They're the threat. They're the reason you can't get a house. They're the reason things are expensive. They're the reason you can't trust the political elites. And I think Zach Polanski, who leads the Green Party over here, who just won a sort of historic by-election in Manchester, it's interesting because he is a progressive politician who's willing to talk about villains, millionaires and billionaires and companies. And I think it's interesting to see that, the Labour Party led by Keir Starmer is very neutered because they constantly want to talk about the cost of living. And, they're always having these resets and pivots where it's like, Keir just needs to talk about the cost of living. And then, but it's like, why is this like, but it's like the cost of living on its own, like, as you say, like it's milk toast. It's like, we don't like that things are expensive, but it's like, but if you can't say why things are expensive and the other side is saying, like, the Reform candidate that just lost in our by-election, he talks about the cost of living, Matt Goodwin. He says, yeah, the cost of living has gone up because of immigrants. And I think it is interesting, this idea of like, you have to have a villain. Like every story has to have a villain and a hero. And if you don't have it, then like the sort of silence or gap you leave just lets the right story kind of creep in. I don't know if that's the same thing in the US, but that really, for me, like resonates with I think what progressives are grappling with here.
Yeah, that's very well put. Imagine a Superman movie where all he does is fly around Metropolis for 2 hours. How boring a movie would that be, right? For anybody who disputes that, I think they just need to hear what you just said. I mean, the other side has a story. So you want to go into battle with no story and compete against someone with a story? We need a story. Maybe there's two camps of those who are bought off and those who are ignorant. And maybe ignorant is actually better in that situation because at least they could be informed, right? Those who are paid for to not attack billionaires or challenge their power are a big problem, especially when they masquerade as politically savvy people.
Right. They're like, we're
Right.
the grown-ups.
We're the grown-ups, right? So there's a couple things to put in the mix here. I mean, first of all, you and I have talked on this podcast and off about taxing the wealthy. I know the patriotic millionaires in the UK are doing great work.
Got to do it. We've got to tax the rich.
Got to
They
tax
got to
the
be
rich,
taxed.
right? There's some initial folly when, whether it's Democrats in this country or Labour politicians in the UK, almost incorrectly create their manifesto or their campaign promises to box themselves out from doing really popular things, right? In this country, it might be people saying, I don't accept PAC money, political action committee money. That includes groups like ours that are funded by grandmas writing $3 checks. That includes labor unions, and that includes Goldman Sachs and OpenAI and other giant corporate Goliaths. And those who are thinking more intentionally say, I don't accept corporate PAC money. And that one little difference, both of which are intended to project, I'm not bought, that one little difference can be huge about who are you fighting for, right? So labor's decision to say we will not raise any taxes, income taxes in their manifesto, as opposed to saying we will not raise taxes on working people. We will not raise taxes except on the ultra wealthy, right? Not give themselves the space means that they're out here attacking farmers, threatening to cut off healthcare, doing things that are a logical extension of the math predicament they've put themselves in because they've chopped off their most financially lucrative and popular politically option, right? It's malpractice. And that's why, there is a loophole where actually a wealth tax would not violate the manifesto of the Labor Party. So maybe they should do that. But then you have people like, Chancellor Reeves, who I don't think it's in her gut. I don't think she has a theory of power where she believes we should actually tax wealth. I think for her, it might just be as simple as a math problem and talking to people in her social networks or whatever. And that's a problem. We need people who actually are true believers.
Didn't she talk about Rachel Reeves fiscal rules, which she made up. So, like these are rules that she made up that tied her hands, that if you asked like 1,000 people out on the street, they would not be able to tell you about. And they didn't vote for Labour because of the fiscal rules. They voted for Labour because they didn't like the Tories. So like there's a sort of like fiction of like, well, we simply can't. And you're right, they've raised a ton of taxes that maybe made less sense, like national insurance, like that point about it not being in your gut. In the most recent budget that was last autumn, there was an attempt to bring in a sort of mansion tax, like a property tax for properties worth more than £2 million. But it was done in this sort of like, as you say, like we need cash. How can we get cash? What's a price point for a property that won't catch any Labour-leaning voters in cities like London where prices have gone high? But it wasn't no one sat down and was like, how can we get money out of property and landowners in the UK where there's huge concentrations of wealth? Because you're right, it wasn't in her gut. It's not something she wants to do. She doesn't wake up every morning being like, how can I take on the big guys for the little guys? Well, I assume maybe Rachel Ryan, if that's not true. I guess what I'm interested in America, though, is like, there isn't really an excuse for Labour politicians to, not be economically populist because we don't have the same amount of money in politics as you guys do. So Reform UK just got the single biggest ever donation to a political party, which was £9 million. So a like aviation crypto guy, I mean, he gave more than 9 million over the course of last year, but that was like biggest ever single donation from someone in the UK.
And
So
there's no
we're
limits. There's no limits. Someone can just legally give that much.
yeah, you have to declare donations above £1,000. They're currently on limits unless you're in a campaign period. So just
Mm,
generally. And
mm.
so total in 2025, there were £65 million worth of donations made to political parties in the UK. And most of them will have gone to Reform, some to the Conservatives, some to Labour. But like, I guess my question to you is like, if you're a Democrat, is it viable to run if you don't have some, billionaire money, PAC money? Like, can you guys support all of the people that like, is there also partly a like, I'm doing a deal with the devil because like it's so expensive to be a politician? Or do you think that's just an excuse?
Is it possible to run without them? Absolutely. AOC is a good example of someone who, of all members of Congress, I think she raised the most in the last quarter just because she's being so ridiculously awesome that grassroots are flocking to her. That's not really scalable. Everybody can't be especially awesome. Otherwise, they're just normal, right? So there is a little bit of there's only so many seats on the boat kind of thing there. But not one rung down, there are people who run genuinely grassroots campaigns. What I've observed is that those who have some of the most cutting edge proposals or are in the biggest position of influence and doing something that actually would challenge power are the ones who get whacked the hardest. So to give an example, a name folks in the UK probably haven't heard of, but a guy named Sherrod Brown, longtime pro-union populist who won a swing state, Ohio, and was in the US Senate for I think about 24 years. He graduated to be the chair of the very powerful finance committee proposing crypto legislation that would hold big crypto interests accountable and have rules of the road. They hated it. And they just spent at least $40 million, if not more, on that one race to blow him out of the water.
And
He is
they is
actually
like
running
crypto packs or like
crypto packs, and some people might have chipped in a few $1,000s and it added up, but others could just cut multi-million dollar checks. And part of the lesson that I worry that particularly crypto and now AI interests have learned is there is infinite ROI, infinite return on investment to political money spent, right? Elon Musk invested $200 million for Trump, and his fortune went up $200 billion in the weeks after Trump was elected. These crypto folks spent about $40 million against Sherry Brown. They helped elect Donald Trump, and they basically have no rules now. And one of their main spiritual leaders, so to speak, is literally in the White House writing a policy, which opens up the floodgates to them just making billions and billions of dollars. So, and then like a little drop in the bucket is the $3 billion that I mentioned is going to Donald Trump. That's just like a small sliver of their huge pot of money. That's a problem. It's pernicious, and you can be thankful that you're not dealing with that. There are still reasons that Democrats or labor leaders might be on the wrong side of this. One is a talking point that we just need to call out at every instance, which is this threat by rich people to leave if taxes get too high.
we get that here too.
Yes. And it just studies have been done. It's not true. There could be preemptive campaigning done to just brand them as, the opposite of a patriot, right? I think there are logistical, how many people really want to leave their parents, their families, their social circles to go to Croatia or wherever they want to go, right? Like they're just not going to do that. There might be a more plausible version of that in this country where you can move over a state, but they're not going to leave the country. And again, most people have communities where it'd be very disruptive to their lives, particularly if it's a 2% wealth tax. Really, for 2%, you're gonna disrupt your entire being? No. The other argument that people who hang out too much in boardrooms or in rooms with C-suite type people convince themselves of is that the public loves corporations and the public wants to be a billionaire, so you can't attack billionaires and you can't challenge corporate power. Last cycle, we were actually in this awkward, accidental situation where the main committee in charge of electing House Democrats, called the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, had seen our polling on things like corporate price gouging of groceries. Again, who's the villain? Why are prices going up? Well, Democrats could be blamed because we had the White House at the time, or corporations that are intentionally jacking up prices, again, at the grocery store, gas pumps, utilities, et cetera. And they invited us to brief some of the most competitive candidates. But they had another group on the call as well, which is kind of corporate funded, called Third Way in this country. They've admitted on the record that the majority of their funding comes from Wall Street. And I said to this committee, I was like, "Are you sure you want us both on? Because you're giving advice. We have very opposite advice."
Literally the opposite advice. Okay.
Yeah, and they said no, they're going to talk about immigration, which they're a little bit more credible on, and you're going to talk about economics. I'm like, okay. So they're witnessing us talk to all these candidates about challenging corporate power, calling it corporate price gouging. They were pleasant. They said, "Oh, that all makes sense. The one thing we'd suggest is don't paint with too broad a brush. You don't want to imply that all corporations are price gouging or that corporations in general price gouge. You really want to kind of narrow it down to the baddest of the apples and call them out." And to me, it's two versions of saying the same thing for a politician saying it. But I emailed them afterwards and I was like, I'm interested in what you said. We do polling all the time. We can actually A/B test this, like split our sample in half, have our version versus your version, see which one does better. Do you have any language that you'd propose? They didn't have anything. I'm like, okay, we're going to take our best shot. So we really took our best shot at being like, most corporations are responsible. But for those that jack up prices on people, they should be held accountable versus ours, which is we need to crack down on greedy corporations that are ripping off the grocery store, right?
Which
I
one?
thought theirs would win. Theirs lost. I thought there was a mistake. We did it again. We rewrote it. Again, a really good faith version of what we thought they were trying to say. Theirs lost again. I emailed them afterwards. I'm like, look, we're willing to try a third time, but people are not rooting for corporations. People understand that when we're challenging corporate greed, we're not talking about their employer. We're talking about those that are greedy, but there is a culture of corporate greed. And the same with billionaires. Like this thing I keep hearing from some Democratic politicians, which is everybody wants to be a billionaire, so don't bash billionaires. I'm like, you've got to be kidding me, right? You've got to be kidding me. So one of my challenges next few months is to make sure we have data to back that up. But that, I think, is the last argument standing. Once you get past the realpolitik of the cryptos of the world in our country that can just like take a huge
It's
hammer
like
to
they're
you.
not all billionaires,
Yes.
not all
Right.
corporations. Okay, we're
Anyway,
interesting.
so we just have, and that's why at the end of the day, is it in your gut? Like if you come from corporate America or corporate, London, and those are the only people you hang out with, you have no connection with grassroots, you don't even want to try, your finger's just not on the pulse. And even if we show you a poll, honestly, even if you say, oh, I agree with that, you'll never present the case in the right way. We need people who are full throated. And those are the people who will change society for the better.
Thank you for listening. If you want to hear more from Adam, please sign up to support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/over the top under the radar.